Hello everyone, today we talk about the Western Roman army during the 5th century. We usually talk about Roman warfare without distinguishing much between East and West, if not anecdotally, cursorily, and en passant. So I thought to dedicate this video to an introduction to the Western Roman army, about which specifically, of course, we will make multiple videos. We have a quite nourished and appreciated, must say, playlist about late Roman warfare in general, so we do not need further introduction. At least you have those videos if you wanna just refresh your memory and or just get acquainted to my take specifically. Then of course there are books too, but of course it's not my interest, at least as a YouTuber, to simply direct you towards that, if anything, because I specialize in another period. But of course, just a little joke to crack here. But it's important to, of course, focus on this period as much as we can. I often point out that late antiquity is sort of overrated by a certain cultural trend in the historiography of the last half century or so. There's been objectively a moment in the last decades which you could see a disproportionate amount of publishing on this era, for reasons that I'm not going to digress on in this video, and that compared to other periods, including the ones I studied, it's not kind of less important or less relevant, especially when we talk about the political and military history. I studied, as you know, essentially the early 14th century in Western warfare, right? But there is a great disproportion. Reason for which, when I talk about late Roman warfare, late antiquity in general, I always have, say, a great caution in trying to address the audience towards certain aspects of this phenomenon that I think are sort of have been, for ideological reasons, sort of hidden, right, and or say neglected because it didn't fit the purpose for which this overabundance of publishing, at least given this specific cut that was given to it, had focused on. I'm also going to resume my series about the Roman army that I think I abandoned in October. We will get to the late Roman army, about which I specifically already discussed, but also through some other aspects. And you know that in the history of the Roman military, there wasn't in the 5th century anything like a military reform, right? The changes in the Roman army were not the fruit of some specific legislation, reorganization of the military, right? It's rather the dramatic development of the situation that generates in different areas of the empire, and within the same Alps, of course, some, in fact, radically different contexts from one another, that brings the Roman high command to adapt locally the art of war to these new changes, right? This is important because we often over-conceptualize certain reforms and sort of skip other important changes throughout the development of the military, as it just is brought by war itself, like just the way armies modify themselves before any great reformer comes around and just basically formalizes what de facto is already there, right? So for political and strategical reasons, the Eastern Roman Empire managed to, survive literally the 5th century. We made just the other day a video about 6th century Byzantine warfare. Regarding this, it's sort of easy to say, well, the East was richer as it was not actually more urbanized than the West. That's instead a thing, in fact, I would highlight in some part. But in any case, the political and social foundations were such that essentially the West simply ceased to exist, at least in a political, formal sense, and the Eastern Roman Empire went on as the Roman Empire, what I call, without too many problems, actually the Byzantine one, just conventionally. And so Byzantinists, that is, specialists in the same field, it's still called in this way, do, right, without any too much controversy at least. But there is also an aspect to consider in general. We will talk about the reasons of the survival of the East in some other video. For example, this one is dedicated, of course, to the West. There will be a complementary one for the East, right? But we tend to overlook often how both halves literally went through the same identical phenomena during the same time, with the same dynamics, right? There was a moment in which the East could be hijacked, for example, by Germanic commanders, in which some enemies could arrive to cripple significantly this reality politically and territorially. And as a consequence, as a consequence of the fact that these survive, we tend to say, well, but it's as if these blows had been softer there. It's actually not the case, and this, of course, speaks of the resilience of the Eastern half. But today we talk about the Western Roman army, that, as we know, it went through a series of situations that brought to its literal dissolution. So, at least as an institution, actually, there is a very interesting, of course, side of the story, that is the actual survival of the Roman military after the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire, specific armies and units that went on, even just by tradition, to serve the Romano-Germanic powers and being actually revered for their professional quality and maintaining always this very strong Roman identity, also among the later generations, and of course they're lost in the mists of early medieval warfare. Of course, they were destined to fade in that regard, but in this sense, do not underestimate also the legacy of the Roman army in the West. And we will have surely a chance to talk about this more in depth, both the survival of single units and especially how, in great part, what we see still in Western Europe is politically, legally, administratively, essentially the same Roman state, reduced to, of course, much less shrank, remodeled, but still, civilizationally and statally speaking, basically the same thing. In any case, the element at the root of the dissolution of the Western Roman army was the rapidly increasing weight that in the strategical matters of the pars occidentes, the autonomous contingents expressed by the barbarian groups that were settled in the empire, right? And the elevated concentration of which in the West was not due much to the, for example, what also interested the East from an earlier age, that is to say, the settlement of the Goths, that chunk that would have become later on historiographically as the Visigoths in the within the Roman Empire, but rather the crossing of the Rhine just after the beginning of the 5th century, that brought literally to the loss in a single blow of several provinces of the West that at some point would never be recovered, right? The Visigoths themselves actually, as you know, end up participating to this by settling in Aquitaine after having sacked the same Rome, and that would have eventually settled in Spain. What's interesting about the Visigoths is that they still, by say in the 60s of the 5th century, could have been extirpated, had actually surrendered to the western half if the Vandals of Gaiseric had not stood in the way. There was actually nothing deterministic about the end, let's say, of the always what was an administrative part of the broader Roman Empire, right? But of course, the way things come to be are always more interesting and more important, if anything, because they are real, and so you have to understand why things went the way they did. You have in the let's say in the West this essentially unmitigated invasion that the Roman military simply cannot handle in a resolutive way. The East had actually absorbed the Goths after Adrianople. There had been times in which, especially on the Persian frontier, you had, say, 1/3 of the Eastern Roman army made up of Goths, which did cause some problems. Objectively, wasn't just you have to balance the idea of the Roman military standards remained always top. Yes, they did in relative terms to other peoples, and or like nothing happened, right? This changes like the Battle of Adrianople and the settlement of the Goths in the Balkans. It's, this did not touch this quality and the actual disorder that followed that point, because the so-called Constantinian army, basically everything that the Romans field from during the 4th century up until Adrianople, in fact, is actually a remarkable force, right? In tactical terms, it's actually the strongest Roman army that ever existed, and the standards were pretty darn high. And as we will see also for the West, up until late, like as long as there was a Roman state, but the Roman military was really damn good. But there were surely some fluctuations, right? In the recent video I made about the late Roman military, I highlighted this point. I mean, that is true, but how true it is to the degree, of course, this army eventually went dissolved, and why, right? And so the problem is not much in the military organization or training, whatever, but what was happening behind the scenes, politically and socially, and that's the interesting part. So, but this is the important point. After the Rhine crossing in 406, you have in the West a situation that the East would never really experience. After all, the Goths settled still in the Balkan hinterland. Was not really a particularly florid area, nor the Goths basically crossed the empire, if not later, as literally a Roman army, because they began to substitute essentially the Illyrian provincial army, also in terms of supplies and local administration, with the actual, say, Gothic people, right? At least the chunk that had entered the empire. These are the same areas that later the so-called Ostrogoths would settle in. I made a video about both peoples if you're interested. Some old ones, but hopefully we'll talk about Gothic warfare more soon. But you don't have like different Germanic, and not only, but also Iranian peoples we have seen, and unevenly distributed. I made a series about the Alans, and that were not an entire people at that point. They were actually mostly following the bigger German groups, but were also more qualitative than them, and they sided eventually more with the Roman administration than the Germans actually did. In the East, you have still a control situation, and the Goths are basically the only instance of this settlement. The West is not like this. And again, today is not really the video to explain why this had even happened originally in the first place. Surely, there are multiple factors, not just demic concentration and less resources in general, but also probably the way Latin culture had affected the West compared to Greek culture in the East. Right, the fact that the Romans had really molded countries like Gaul and Spain, to a point that had favored it as actually the greatest success of Romanization, some sort of provincial identity locally that matched with that same concept of reward for having served Rome and having become Roman, yes, but managing some regional spheres that, in the absence of resources, would be more autonomously minded, right? In spite of, again, of the enormous infrastructural, let's say, system that the Romans had established there, and did favor, in fact, also this provincial, even secession at some point in the future. Still, there was a Romanity that was holding on, like the myth that, say, the Romans were sort of beginning to be fed up with being an empire or Romans or whatever is not really correct. The Germans literally did invade these territories. They took them by force, even when they were, of course, negotiating their settlement. There was a resources exhaustion, surely a moral collapse of some sort. This, of course, did bring to the acceptance of the new rulers, but when the system was sensibly worn out, right? And not even generating an actual societal change in most of the situations. This is very evident in Gaul or in Spain, that were ruled respectively by the Franks, the Burgundians, the Visigoths, in a rigidly oligarchic fashion, right, with a full continuity with the Roman societal system. Countries like Britain and Italy had it different for different reasons. I explained this difference. There is a migration era playlist in which I go. It's, if you have not gotten into the basics at a point, like, it's not surprising to some extent. It's not so intuitive, right? And this is not even it's not even telling you the degree of actual cultural Romanity that existed. Some of the single most Germanically identitary countries were also some of the most strongly culturally Romanized, right? And this is an idea that, of course, makes, I think, most of those migration era lovers sort of cognitively dissonant, because, as I found out after several years on YouTube talking about these topics, people do not care absolutely anything about historical reality. They just hear for the meme of the cultures that they think they represent, even though they're disgusting third millennium slobs compared to their ancestors that would have, of course, used them as slaves and spit in their faces because of the sheer disgust. But this is also why it's funny talking about this period telling the truth, because it's really a big mess, and hardly anybody really, could find themselves, regardless of the objective improvement of their situation. This is especially evident for the Germans coming from Central Europe, fully stabilized and fully, capable of holding, right, to the situation. Some peoples, like the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, were reconquered by the Romans. Some others basically collapsed into dynastic branches that couldn't quite rejoin the originary power. Think about the Merovingians. The Visigoths are taken over by the Arabs that arguably at that point had essentially interiorized a Byzantine, Persian, and mostly Romano-Hellenistic sense of state. So it's there is a lot going on, and that's why we should actually talk way more about this era in the first place. But speaking of these groups, positions, say this, I will use the term barbarian because there weren't just Germans in the West, as you know. They're talking about the Iranians, many groups, but all these peoples were sensibly mixed to an extent, not to the one that multiculturalism would like to stress. There was definitely a clear, sound Germanic basis and prevalence majority, and a capacity also of Germanization culturally. But there were, of course, people of different backgrounds: Iranian, Slavic, Turkic, and more. Not talking about essentially the the Romanized population, the Romano-Celtic world, etc. But at least, and this was the main change from the previous centuries, like that until the 3rd century do not witness properly, at least actively aggressive confederacies moving around the continent. These groups are really compact, cohesive. They have a major shock force because they are militarized peoples, right? Being a freeman, they're equated to be a warrior, not necessarily a fully professional elite one. Actually, these groups are all, in fact, they're very different from, say, I don't know, Tacitus Germans. They are heavily stratified. Like the oligarchy is very powerful, very punching. Some peoples more, some peoples less. Like the Goths were the most Romanized and the most hierarchical in many ways. Peoples like the Anglo-Saxons were barely, like, in fact, even a single group telling the truth. In any case, their position towards the Western court, for those that actually engaged with it, because some just would take over, but mostly just at the fringes of the Western half, was defined on the basis of treatises that were generally known as Foedera, which means simply alliance, hence the term Foederati. So those the allied, the allies, and through which the barbarians obtained this essentially economical and territorial support in exchange for their availability to provide the Western Roman Empire with garrisons and military expeditions, while their troops were being essentially equated to the imperial regulars from the point of view of the right to the unknown, and that is to say the distribution of supplies and equipment obtained through the fiscal collection, mostly in nature, not entirely, applied to the local population, and to the Hospitalitas, that is essentially the billeting right within the territory of the population, yet according to precise rules, right? And given the resources shortages and or the exhaustion of the local resources, even just the fact that there was some group with hundreds, say several tens of thousands, sometimes even hundreds of thousands of people that could settle in a province and sort of replenish it in terms of manpower, labor force. These groups are never demographically prevalent. There were always a minority, especially the most powerful provinces occupied were also the most populated, the most advanced, most Romanized, and in fact, as we were just saying before, these are the places where essentially the Roman state goes on, right? These peoples are technically settled within the empire. When you look, I don't know, at Theodoric's Goths that are sent literally by Constantinople into the west after that Odoacer had returned to the east the Western imperial insignia, people say, well, at that point the West does not exist anymore. The concept is completely wrong, right? Because we're not talking about an empire. We're talking about an administrative repartition, right? These people settling in Southern Europe were deeply aware and convinced of the fact that they were within the Roman Empire, and there wasn't much you could do about that because these were largely intact and overwhelmingly populated still for the times, especially the places from which these peoples came, Roman communities, Roman countries, Roman realities. And of course the Germans were quite aware of the fact that they wanted to preserve this at all costs because it was dramatically more advantageous than they had ever had in their hands. The only problem being that there was in fact still a senatorial elite ruling these countries, and there are different political issues regarding this that basically get solved in different ways. but mostly also in that case witness an important continuity, right? There could have not been a Merovingian empire specifically without a Gallo-Roman senatorial and episcopal elite that literally married into the Germanic one. The same goes for Theodoric's Italy, that basically is the largest power in the West. It vassalizes the Visigoths. It has major international relations. It's the highest success in the Romano-Germanic integration, in spite even of the tensions that did exist and that in fact eventually escalated in the Gothic War, but in a country that otherwise would have in fact been much better off without the Byzantine reconquest, that at that point was literally a foreign invasion. So even the concept of Romanity must be understood on the basis of what these provincial identities really were. I made a video about the Romano-Italic aristocracy, for example. Also about the Constantinian Senate, and other, we'll talk about other, like the Gallo-Romans especially, are very important. I made some video about those. But in this sense, like and I tell you because I see it on YouTube, like that there is this swing between either, Byzantine is Roman. It's actually a crime against humanity to call the Easterners as Byzantines instead of Romans, because they were Romans and there's nothing you can do. It's Romans. They are all Romans, and this turns into all alike, right? Everybody from Armorica to Egypt was exclusively and univocally Roman, and everybody was Roman. It was not. No, this was a universal empire, right? So Romanity exists, of course, at a metaphysically divine ecumenic level, but it doesn't mean that the peoples that are supposed to have attained this are literally alike. This is a heresy in imperial Catholic terms that are also the same so-called pagan ones, without any change, even with the advent of Christianity. From the other side, there is the idea of, essentially the Germans were fighting against the Romans and they wanted to exterminate them, and, this I don't know, during the Gothic War, it was just the Romans that were opposed to the Germans, and so they called other Romans, and that's the clash of cultures and whatever. No. Right, I made a video specifically the one about the Latin Germanic ties during the Gothic War, during the Gothic siege of Rome, that speak widely about the entire issue of what essentially different populations within the same that were Roman. That's the point. They were at a level, right? At another level, they were. What, in fact, as a Roman, is what you are in front of God. And so what you do in that condition is really what determines eventually how worthy of Romanity you are, right? The Saxon emperors literally changed their ethnic identity from Germanic to Roman in an ecumenic institutional way, because nobody in the West had ever thought that there had been any other empire or possibility of rule beyond Rome, right? Surely the Germanic peoples who took over the West were incredibly proud of having defeated the Romans and having, however, essentially protected them, sheltered them, having elevated themselves above them as well, and still being aware, of course, that this Romanity was evidently ahead civilizationally, and so that on the long run, by still calling themselves, Goths, Longobards, etc., in many ways there was something about the Romanity of the empire that transcended these local separations, in fact, because, of course, their only purpose, as any other power, was to rule the world entire, and they were always seeking to attain this, right? You have a 10th century Anglo-Saxon kings that called themselves not imperatores, but basileioi, right? Literally. So this, of course, being inspired to the current Constantinopolitan power, that is much the extent to which Romanity had forever altered the ethnic ecumenicity of the world, right? And there has never been any other horizon among any other people, right? Being out of the empire is also just not a positive thing from anybody involved. Like, those who remained at the outskirts of development, of civilization, of general well-being and power and political capacity. So I cannot stress enough how important for these hospitas in centuries like the fifth, it had been to substitute themselves literally as armies to the Roman army in these provinces. I mean, the mere concept of Germanic monarchy, in the way it eventually is accomplished as the concept of a single people, like the Visigoths, with a political and territorial affirmation as a unitary power, is a Roman product, right? The Visigoths are born essentially because the Romans create them as the Roman army of Illyricum, right? They weren't called like that, of course, but essentially that model of kingship that Alaric embodies is also the one that any other German ruler eventually seeks to attain. Like, think about Gaiseric, Theodoric, Clovis, all the great heroes of the migration era, Alboin. These are all, and the Germans are obsessed with that. I mean, if you go to Anglo-Saxon Britain, there is epos about these people, right? They were literally obsessed by what they had accomplished, and there is an interesting degree, of course, of ambiguity regarding, for example, the ethnic allegiance. What, say, in that 10th century Anglo-Saxon context, the idea of Romanity was seen, like, of course, after Christianization, especially, that had sort of kicked in at a much higher level. But let's say during the 5th century, you can definitely debate about the intentions of these peoples. But of course, the elites were enlightened just by the fact that they were in charge and handling these very complex situations. And of course, what they seek purposefully, as long as they can have that, is actually as some sort of blend with at least a delegation of Roman power. This is what, for example, I don't know, Clovis forces himself, pushing himself to the extreme to get from every single direction. This is what the Goths do with the councils of Toledo, mimicking Constantinople. Other peoples like the Longobards and the Anglo-Saxons do not do this, at least more than much, because they come to rule over societies that were not functional to that sense of ecumenic accomplishment anymore, because they were in the moment of greatest contraction, and so they were, first of all, mostly thinking about surviving, but also about consolidating specific regional dimensions, right? And so just wait and see. Also, I don't know, the Longobards later would become protectors of the Romans and would open to that sense of Romanity. But these indicators are still to be seen throughout early medieval history. We discussed abundantly, especially think about all the videos about the Longobards, considering how much these peoples had Romanized themselves in the first place. That's what I was saying before. The Longobards are the only people that never compromises institutionally with any trace of Romanity. Yet they're the single most ethnically Romanized and Roman kingdom of all the Germanic ones, right? So this is, I think, very relevant in the longer term, that these guys were always considering when talking about the imperial Catholic tradition within, of course, every person found themselves, at least until the Protestant Reformation, right? So that's something we must absolutely recover when thinking about, what does it mean to essentially enter the niche to which a part of the imperium of the world rule was attached, right? This is what the Hospitalitas, the Foederati entail, right? And it's unfortunate, in fact, from a historical point of view, that beyond this general lines of again, the unknown, the Hospitalitas, etc., we do not know the actual terms of the single federa that obviously varied on the basis of the contractual power of the groups involved, right? The sources are pretty scanty about the conditions under which these people settled. We know that they were there. We know that they were actually pretty eager to have this formalized, because it sort of was an enormous hypothec on their future, right? And of course, these lands were just the richest, the most fertile ones, the ones that you wanted to maintain, to have properly an imperial delegation to put in your bank, right? Even if the Roman Empire was seeking sort of to reconquer these lands in the first place, and at some point even succeeding to do so. And as we well know, conceptually, but also practically, these dynamics were not really unprecedented. Like, the single most important change in this is that these were entire peoples, like in politically cohesive peoples, settled within the Roman boundaries, right? The Romans had always settled these people since ever, right? And in consistent numbers, but they had done so diluting them, or at least Romanizing them in small groups that eventually became some of the greatest success of Romanization. Think about the Germanic ubi since the times of Caesar or Augustus, right? And from the late Empire onwards, the 3rd century crisis, especially the depopulation of the empire due to the destabilization of the system, had brought more, had made the settlement of larger groups, especially for the sake of increased manpower and especially labor force within the Roman Empire, more acceptable, right? This was always based on we crush the barbarians, but we're so magnanimous that as Romans, of course, we want to transfigure them into a divine race, and for which we give them a chance to become Romans, and we don't kill them, but we settle them in our own lands, right? And they became essentially peasants that will eventually also provide with a certain amount of military levies, and so on. And again, human resources were particularly precious at this point in history, right? This is basically the entire leitmotif of also the levy issues we talk about, the Diocletian, the reforms back in the day, the necessity of just securing a certain stability in human settlement, districtuation, so that you would know exactly how many resources were present in the territory, how much you could collect from there, and even with a logic that was like the more sparsely populated the territory, the more you actually have to work to make it populated, because this system has in theory to re-expand, but naturally this was not really the time in the globe to do so, but it was an attempt, of course, to resist the crisis, the depletion, right? So in many ways, the settlement of these barbarian groups was the immediate consequence of the solution, also the internal resistance of the same resources to stop them, like literal armies, levies, manpower, and the attempt to just tie these guys to an imperial power that, again, was not like a 19th century Victorian age sort of political territorial side. It's literally the transcendental Catholic ecumenic one, for which Rome is not just something you can put in, say, next to any other power. It's just by the fact that you're born in the world, you are meant to be a Roman subject, and fundamentally you will become that, also because through this Hospitalitas, what you have is also a cooptation, how many barbarian generals you really have at this point, and how effective and and loyal to the empire they had been to arrive actually to the highest posts in the military. In part, it was also an ethnic reason, right? In the West, there were more barbarians in the first place, and so you would have them there, obviously. But you do not find these guys siding with the other barbarians, at least to deliberately damage the empire, right? If anything, it's actually for taking it over, right? It's the case of Stilicho with Alaric, which shows you also how powerful still the Roman military really was. I mean, the Goths were defeated repeatedly by the Roman military that could simply wipe them out. They had cornered them like cat with mouse, but still, at every step of the way, they spared them, because evidently they could use these Foederati as a pawn, especially in this sort of east and west sort of back and forth struggle, right? Because these peoples were problems, just like today's immigrants, that nobody wants them, obviously enough. And even though there is a way you can invest them into this, you can sort of integrate them into the system, still this comes with an internal lack of standards of quality, and so it actually keeps on increasing the problem that is primarily a moral one, right? And that encompasses both, right, at the end of a major expansion cycle that had been the one, in fact, of the same empire that is the reason why also these peoples are on the move in the first place, right? They're just a consequence of that. For the rest, the Roman administration, including and especially the military one, was very well acquainted with these migration management, how to handle these barbarians, and in many ways it had been done in very cruel ways, which at some point, think about Adrianople, causes some significant backlash. In the context of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, the number of barbarian groups involved and their contractual power was becoming really, really important, right? After all, by the time Alaric sacks Rome, for example, which is done also in a very tidy way, let's say the empire doesn't seem shattered in a political, territorial sense. In morally, yes, but let's say a few generations before, like, the empire was just all one. There didn't give any sign of collapse or whatever, especially because of these groups that evidently here were just playing from within the system without compromising the territorial unity of the same. At the end of the century, the western half of the Roman Empire does not exist anymore, right? And you have large amounts of peoples that have now basically just settled them for good. Within this Roman system, I can't stress enough how Roman this was, but still without anyone wanting to take on the responsibility of sort of putting things together, because even if there was a will from the various provinces now to stabilize on the basis of these new rulers, and that if an empire had to put back this together, a much greater cooperation would have been needed, a much greater political unity, which in the West, ipso facto, had ceased to be. And this had been the critical aspect, right? How to manage these barbarians. Their loyalty was swinging on the basis of the change of the situation and the consequent opportunity to draw tangible advantages for an improvement in the conditions of subsistence of the group, or even a further move, right, territorially, even further, a political career. The various leaders in the social, political, and military hierarchies of the empire, right? So it's not even just an expansionistic thing. It's not just one people wanting to remain just in that way and simply actually scoring the biggest hit. For example, Odoacer's deposition of the of Romulus Augustus is carried out not by a people, really, right? There are some ethnic groups that are prevalent, the Sciri, from which St. Odoacer stemmed, but the Italian army at that time was composed essentially by war bands of very different background, right? They were not a people as a whole, like, I don't know, the Visigoths or the Burgundians. Hence, especially when you see how many of these leaders had risen, in fact, to the very top through the military itself, you realize that still remained till the end a viable opportunity to handle, to manage, that you would discard until it was ever less effective, because depleted in this process of the actual purpose for which it had been established. Historically, it's a bit like the same Odoacer's rendition of the Western Imperial insignia to the east, right? There wasn't technically anything going on through that move. It was just Odoacer saying, okay, let's not elect emperors anymore because they're kind of useless. We can simply rule this place on our own, and without having this other nuisance or pretending to act as if there is still a functional power. But again, nothing really changed, nor actually these groups in Italy wanted other groups to, say, rule from there, for example, entering or stripping them of their their position. But going back in time from 395 to 410, there is no doubt that it had been the so-called Visigoths of Alaric to be the protagonist of the political, strategical, and diplomatic events in the Roman Empire. Right? He wasn't really the guy who was making the thing. He was the guy who was causing the thing, because the two halves were not happy of this undiluted Gothic people within their boundaries, and so they were, as we were saying before, just throwing it at each other, with dire consequences. Many cities were devastated, including Rome, and definitely it was an ambiguous relation that the same Alaric had unavoidably, just trying to survive, basically, with the two imperial courts, right? So we in a period of strong reciprocal tension that was caused by that, because otherwise the two halves were not really conflictual with one another. They, even in cases of intervention in each other's affairs, they would render the various, for example, reconquered provinces to one another. They weren't really, in fact, emerging, even historically, as to, let's say, politically opposite realities. They were very different in ethnic, cultural, linguistic terms, but they still understood the obvious advantage of having a major imperial power, mostly based on the Mediterranean basin, but of course also capable, especially in the west, to maintain, hopefully capable of maintaining the various continental areas. There were some, again, of the masterpieces of Romanization, especially Gaul and Spain, and to a great extent, especially the Mediterranean provinces of these countries were always very connected historically. That also in the later centuries, we've seen it very often in our videos about early medieval history and beyond. So in other words, Alaric was highlighting how a militarily relevant barbarian entity that was, again, supplied, trained, and experienced just in the Roman army as such. So they had high standards, even though they were, as a whole, people beaten, as we've seen by the actual Roman regulars, could still, and that's the Clausewitzian point, like a continuation of politics with other means, right? Highlight this could allow this leader to exploit these contradictions, these divisions, these sort of varying interests, including the fact that nobody wanted the barbarians in a right state of mind. Now, in the initial phase of the 5th century, in Gaul, after the aforementioned shifts of limitane frontier troops from the Rhine, due to the necessity, strategic necessities on other fronts, and the coast, part of the coast of the invasion of 406, that this destructured in great part the Rhine military districts that had been the single most militarized ones in the previous centuries. The empire had to cope with the situation by entrusting in great part to the same barbarian groups of the same barbarian Foederati the defense of the river frontier. That, of course, had the purpose of preventing other penetrations, while the Roman diplomacy was working in order to manage the barbarian contingents that had already penetrated deep into the Roman territory, and actually acquiring part of these as of them as allies and using them next to the regular forces in the campaigns against the more reluctant groups. This dynamic is crucial, really, for a number of reasons. The first one is that when you look at the Rhine crossing, allegedly on December the 31st, 405, you have a quite interesting phenomenon, that is the Foederati that are already settled within the empire on the left bank of the Rhine try to stop this human avalanche. The Franks, that had been quite ambiguous with the Romans, first enemies, then allies, and back and forth like that, were of course realizing that having settled on that land, it was bad that somebody would come to seize that as well. And so they actually sacrificed themselves to an important extent to try to stem these guys. They were beaten down, and at that point they said, okay, let's not, these peoples are just even wanting, they don't want this lands on the Rhine that are also sort of poor, depopulated. They want to go to places like southern Gaul, Spain. We're talking here the Vandals, the Burgundians, the Alans, etc. So peoples that would also make a mess, in fact, along the way before finally settling down, because this was the point. Nobody was to destroy the lands where they would have settled, but when they passed by others, they would just loot as much as they could. This was the case of the Vandals, right? When you look at when they settled in Africa, well, archaeologically, historically, aside from the damage that had caused to the integrity of the Roman Empire and the fact that they were Arians and or pagans, and so the ecclesiastical invectives against them were quite, topical and, loaded in that negative sense. You do not find actual devastations, persecutions. The Alans, the Vandals destroyed far and wide in Spain, for example, but also just by passing through there, that they wouldn't have the capacity to destructure the Romanity of Spain, that remained, in fact, one of the single most intensely Romanized areas for centuries and centuries. The Franks, at that point, on the lower Rhine, decide to take the chance of this general disorder to expand a little bit their territory further within. And one of the most interesting aspects of the abandonment of the left bank of the Rhine by the Roman military is that this area in Belgica that had remained for centuries, in fact, the single most militarily presided in the empire, was well organized, in fact, to supply large amounts of troops for this very reason. Of course, these events damaged the system locally. That there wasn't, in fact, a power here that could substitute itself to what the Roman one had been historically by might and power. But when you look at the Merovingian army, and especially the Carolingian one, you realize that great part of the military force of the Franks was also infrastructurally served by the Roman vestiges in the area, right? And how even great part of the interconnection in Western Central Europe was continuing, of course, on the basis of the Roman cities, on their ports, and that's in fact something that goes on. I mean, the most developed parts in Germany still today are the Rhineland and southern Germany, right? Northern Germany, Eastern Germany are remarkably more backwards. This has not only to do with, I don't know, socialism. This has to, if you go back in time, actually you can argue that part of the reason why, I don't know, the Soviets conquered as much during World War II is in part because they were following the footprints of the level of development that civilizations were following over the boundaries that the Romans had left, right? In other words, Western Germany, Southern Germany is civilized Germany, and Northern Germany, Eastern Germany is not civilized Germany. And the Germans are extremely aware of this still nowadays. The impact, in fact, of Romanization in their history, in their land, following these boundaries and divides. So at the time, it is a bit like that. It is about ruling the more Romanized places and literally competing for this. And still in a time in which the Roman Empire was there. I mean, it would remain there, even in this case, even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So the political chances to aggrandize oneself, to have a role in the local administration, making career in the Roman army remained, importantly. Without mentioning that for centuries, these same groups had been serving in the Roman army through their war bands. I mean, this is notorious. Just look at all the various units of the Notitia Dignitatum. But just know, historically, like how, of course, these peoples had always revolved around Rome, as far as unavoidably everything was concerned. So establishing also other groups along the frontiers was a way of creating some buffer states of barbarians that knew more or less how to cope with barbarians, that as such were also expendable, right? The Germans, also in the Roman army, if you look at the Goths, for example, they paid an incredibly high tribute of blood within the Roman ranks, right? When you look at Alaric, the incredibly orderly sack of Rome, there was technically just the price, let's say, of the pay that had not been correspondent to them as a Roman army. And in spite of the fact that the Romans had just massacred their women and children, had been taken prisoner after the Battle of Pollentia, one of the other Visigothic defeats against Stilicho, is striking, right? It tells you how much integrated, especially these Gothic groups that had spent a considerable time within the empire already were, right? How mentally framed they were in this Romanity. These peoples, as we will see better now, were also and regularly employed by the Roman field armies to crush other rebellious Foederati and or other barbarian invaders. Generally speaking, they were sort of divided politically within themselves. I mean, the Romans played on these divisions. There were always groups that were sort of more, say, conciliating with the Romans, others that thought that they had to be more independent. It's along this pattern that most divisions would take place, even when they were, and usually this was about Catholicism and Arianism. In a way, it involved essentially the blend with local Romanized elites that still had things like private armies, and they of course controlled the lands, at least to the extent these were not expropriated through the Hospitalitas subdivision. In fact, when we think about the Hospitalitas, you saying, we will get 1/3 of the lands as a deal, right? But we do not actually know how the settlement happened. I mean, of course, the land was the base of all the system at the time, and of course, peoples that settle in certain provinces, even if you make some approximate demographic proportions, could of course seize roughly a part of that, but the way they would actually supply themselves, the way they were distributed within the territory, the way they would be still supported, for example, by the imperial administration or not, in any, political, military, or economic way, it's something that changed constantly, right? So it would be interesting how this... And the normal size was... So the Visigoths are a bit the prototype of, again, one people, one province, one army, right? 30,000 men. We can't be realistic about the actual, at least by Roman standards, what these warriors could be functionally supplied like. And this was also a risk, because you realize that demographically, just one battle could cripple them significantly from a demographic point of view. This is what happens to the Visigoths specifically in Marianus times. The system, in a sense, was coherent. I mean, the situation was messed up, but these were the better proceedings from both the Roman and the Barbarian side, right? And to an extent, there is an important degree of cooperation next to the conflictual one. The potential theater of operations, military-wise, extended within still the boundaries of the West entirely, except perhaps for Britain, but there were still some, as you know, there are some Romano-Brythonic administration, army. We will talk about this, even though we know very few about that. In the areas in which the Allied nuclei were settled, the barbarian garrisons, as we've seen, substituted the Roman ones by acquiring the same rights towards the local population, because in part the Roman army now had been subdivided into, in fact, the field units and the sort of the local ones that were practically tied to the local, to the land, like just as local garrisons de facto more than else, even though the Limitani at some point could be as effective as the Comitatenses historically. And in fact, also within the latter, you start seeing a rapid increase in the importance of the Foederati troops, right? The fealty which was considered was becoming ever more costly in terms of what you had to give these guys in the Fedus, because this was a vicious cycle, right? You gave land to these people because you could not defend it anymore, but in this way you also gave up the opportunity of directly controlling that same land, thus to recruit and equip some regular forces. Admittedly, there wasn't a huge difference between the Roman and the barbarian forces at this point. This is especially true in the West, right? But we do definitely see that as long as the empire existed, it did maintain its traditionally statal system that really provided with the finest military standard. So the Romano-Germanic kingdoms are something surely more structured than what the Roman Empire been, but it had simply been the consequence of the same shrinking of the Roman state. So there's a flow, and as such you see a leveling of the Romano-Germanic standards. Generally, on the basis of the Hospitalitas regime clauses, imperial authority had to turn the barbarian leaders a relevant portion of land and or of fiscal income from the region in which this settlement took place. And this phenomenon was the one causing this deleterious erosion of the resources, generally speaking, destined to the maintenance of the regular army. Given that this system had somewhat always been going on, as soon as it was practiced with these larger groups, it did not cause per se an immediate fall in the effectiveness of the imperial military machine, nor of the broader political territorial cohesion of the Western Roman Empire. It's not looking at these groups per se that is helpful in order to explain like the end of the western half. It's like looking at the tip of the iceberg. There is no doubt that these guys really moved, like say oriented the trend, but this was happening on a basis, literally the same communities and lands that they were coming to rule on that were allowing this to happen. Because they were exhausted, for example, and or because they thought that this presence, as long as it was regulated by the imperial authority, still existing, but still, after all, part of the bigger deal, right? Some of these provinces had attempted, for example, to just take an independent direction. Think about in the 3rd century, the empire of the Gauls with Tetricus. These were purely Roman, actors that said we are essentially defending Gaul with the same way that the empire would do, but we do it on our own because we care more about the place. We're here. We don't need to wait for the central administration. We're Gallo-Romans. It's okay, right? It would have not threatened the unity of the empire world, like, I don't know, the Palmyrene Empire was doing, like following more or less the pattern of the Sasanians, right? Trying to take over the Levant, that was something also historically alien to the core of Roman, say, of the ethnic basis of at least of the Roman center of power in the hinterland, especially, also from a cultural point of view. So, remarkably enough, of course, the Roman control of the Mediterranean continued. The Byzantines still controlled this until the 7th century, so evidently there was a way of controlling things, but we tend to sort of underestimate how much the Roman Empire was composite within itself, right, and how many differences there were on a provincial basis from country to country. This seems to be completely overlooked at times when even we look at the repartitions of the West in the Romano-Germanic kingdoms. These were not simple dice rolls, right? There was some important premise for them to coming to be in the first place. When you look at the effectiveness of the Roman army, still in the mid-5th century, you can't really quite complain, right? The heterogeneous army of Aetius, for example, carried out at least 11 campaigns, mostly victoriously, within 15 years, between 425 and 439, right? This basically maintaining, by the way, its constant movement, right? So this definitely looks like a functional field army based at least on a regional level that maintains quite qualitative standards, and that, as we will see now, remains at the center, as the gluing leadership, let's say authority for also the various Foederati groups in the region, aside from the Metus Hostilis represented by the Huns. this definitely implies a functional logistical system, a good qualitative level, generally. It's again the substitution of this with something else, with the Germanic armies that still keep on operating. We've seen it in the video about Merovingian army organization, for example, on the Roman basis. Right, a Clovis, for example, at the end of the century, could still have armies of 30,000 men with catapults, reaching as far as the south of Gaul, crushing multiple enemies along the way. If you look at the army of Merovingian army of a century later, these are just basically hunting parties of brothers that want to kill each other, right? So the 6th century was especially the moment of biggest shrinking, right? That's in many ways the biggest divide. You can argue that in the 5th century you have a general decline, but you more than else have a substitution with the Roman system. So it's as if that base remained functional, and the others would agglutinate in case of need. And so discriminant is mostly political. Why would they do that? Because you see that also the early medieval polities, at least speaking of the West, because in the West we were lucky enough to have some stability after like the 6th century. It's basically the last migration is the Longobards one into Italy. Right, we're in the 60s. And let's say the eastern half of Europe is a completely different thing. It's a completely different world. The West is much more stable. Like Latin Germanic Europe is, during the early Middle Ages, probably the single most underrated thing ever. And in many ways, of course, the system was exhausted, but you see, in fact, those Romano-Germanic kingdoms established, and they pretty much remain the same. I mean, yes, some, pick the Suebi in the Iberian Peninsula at some point to get obliterated, but it's even in that case, it's mostly a political thing. It's not about these groups making extreme efforts, trying to knock each other out. There is a proto-feudal system kicking in. The calories have been spent. Nobody really wants to move more than much. They want to reorganize. They want to still to seed something in order to cultivate it further in the following centuries. This is a very gradual, right, process. The development, for example, of statehood in Latin Germanic Europe during the high Middle Ages. However, it's also the most successful in the later Middle Ages as well, and one can't argue that basically this was not connected with both the Roman and the Germanic legacy in the way that they had synchronized at this point. So speaking still of the 5th century and still Aetius' arc, gradually the imperial mobile armies that were the actual armies, I mean the field ones that you could move regionally, you could recover provinces with, etc., were gradually transforming in mostly groups of contingents, like associated contingents, in which the regular forces that even were ever more difficult to create, to replenish, had become gradually secondary compared to the number and the weight of the barbarian contingents that, of course, within their political, their ethnic organization, they would maintain their internal hierarchies, their own commanders. I mean, these peoples, as we said, were militarized. They had, aside from their monarchs that were now established together with the territorialization, their own clans that were also logistically self-sufficient, at least in theory, then to have this sort of higher, say, military quality. They had to be in part recruited, trained with this sort of Roman influence, etc. It had historically been mostly the war bands that had represented the comitatus as opposed to the zippe that stayed at home. It was more like a levy militia of some sort, as opposed, in fact, to the first guys that were instead military professionals. Now, absolutely comparable to the ones of the Roman army. Like, if you look at the Battle of Argentoratum, for example, you realize that it was the Celto-Germanic Foederati that saved the Roman right and basically brought the defeat of the Alemanni. I made a video about that. It's one of the old ones, and it's blurred and all, but if you're interested, if you read Ammianus, everything is really very, very, very eloquent. And there was still, however, a level of Roman command. Of course, generals of barbarian origin were there, but they were still Roman generals, specifically. They were part of the imperial hierarchy, right? So you would find often these barbarian levies still commanded by Roman generals. And this is quite interesting because it shows you that, to some extent, the chiefs of these populations, to some extent, were fine being framed under still a Roman hierarchy and command, because they knew also that those guys were, say, very capable militarily wise, so they would accept their people to be framed ever more within that system, because this would bring an advantage to the same barbarian elites that could rise in this administration. In fact, they were gaining an unprecedented power over their peoples, right, socially speaking. When you look at the Hunnic campaign that culminated with the Roman victory of Aetius over Attila in 451 at the Catalaunian plains, you realize that, albeit this operation, the campaign was not really different from other operations of imperial mobile armies against barbarian invaders, as it had happened in the previous century. I mentioned Argentoratum for a reason. However, the contribution of Foederati troops to the Roman forces was so important to hardly attribute a Roman character to this victory. At least this was a Romano-Germanic success overall. We've seen in the videos about the Alans how actually it was this people that was technically not even fighting as a people, differently from, say, the Franks or the Visigoths, as Foederati and properly corresponding to political realities, but these elite troops of steppes knights that sort of saved the day in the center, right? And again, the Roman forces were of high quality, and they fought hard, but overall, right, they weren't decisive, right? And they actually also suffered importantly. And the battle was a great success. Again, this did not bring down ipso facto Attila's fortune, but as we often point out, it's not that the Huns would have ever essentially dominated the Roman Empire. They lacked the means. That the Germans had that. The Germans were culturally compatible with sedentary lifestyle and Romanity. In any case, it's also remarkable how these elements cooperated, right? At the Battle of the Catalaunian plains, the Romano-Germanic army bore the imperial insignia. This, because of the imperial ecumenic tradition, could have not gone otherwise. The supreme commander was a magister militum, right? But you find, of course, the Visigoths, the Alans, the Franks, weighing as much as the Roman regulars. The interesting fact, by the way, is that from the other side, when you look at the Huns, the Ostrogoths, other people, the Gepids, etc., like you find, however, still other, say, groups of the same people, right? At the Battle of the Catalaunian plains, there were Franks from both sides, for example. Obviously, in a let's say, the majority of the Franks was siding as Foederati, obviously with Rome, with civilization, right? There is an important divide in this sense in understanding how these guys really worked. Of course, the Visigoths, the Alans, the Franks from the Roman side were also more Romanized, right? The other groups under Attila instead were surely heavily influenced by Hunnic culture. We know that. We know that from, Longbert graves and more. Like, there was, in a sense, a struggle between two models, and the civilizational one won, right? There were also undecided peoples, or peoples that were trying to save themselves by the thread of their skin, because they had actually been beaten already by other groups like the Burgundians that stayed on the middle of Rhine, between, say, across the river, like so, undecided between the Romans and the Huns. And as you know, also how the Nibelungenlied actually hands down the, say, Aetius Roman forces, but likely also Hunnic auxiliaries that Aetius did have, and that's the reason why perhaps also in the Nibelungenlied you find the history of Attila, of Vienna, etc., even though this was taking place somewhere else. I mean, the Burgundians, the Nibelungs are in Worms, as like the story goes, but eventually it's the Romans that actually crushed the Burgundians and deport them into Sepaudia. I made a video about medieval Savoy and how that came to be, multiple videos about the Burgundians. Hopefully we'll come back on them as well. So times were changing, definitely. These are the last 20 years of the West. In the regular contingents, doesn't matter how much they would preserve, as we'll see now better, within their units, their cadres, the traditional characteristics of compactness that were proper of the imperial army, together with higher training and technique, discipline especially, they did not possess anymore such a way to be able to characterize the nature of these armies in the West now as purely Roman, right? Given that these forces, and also great part of the same Romans technically, because here we don't talk about citizenship anymore. These are essentially Roman subjects that were of barbarian ancestry themselves. And this, again, had always been a thing in the Roman army. I mean, that the Roman army always, in every single time in history, had more foreigners than Romans. Always, right? So this is, as you understand, not the factor in itself, right? It's rather about how, say, what kind of resources are left to exploit in order to keep the system up, which is a completely different issue, right? Think about how functional the Roman army was in, say, the Principate, when half of it was made up of auxiliaries. Very often it was just the latter that fought. Even we've seen it at the Battle of Mons Graupius. Of course, the Roman legionaries would, and they would also cause colossal baths of blood, and because of their extreme quality. But the numbers pretty much the same. Nobody says, "Oh my God, those guys were, half barbarians," like, and so that was not the Roman army, right? Here it's another story, because you see that it's the Roman political power that has shrunk compared to these other groups that maintain their own political autonomy within the same, what had been the same empire. So it's again a shifting of allegiances, of let's say, it's a matter of availability of resources. Keeping things together does cost, right? It requires that transcendental power that had made Rome great, and that now was sort of fading, shrinking, and bringing everybody down with them, because this had been, again, what the world had done. And now the world was sort of going down pretty much everywhere. And in many ways, of course, the Roman army looks ever more like the one of its adversaries, that actually in the most terrible of ways is the same Roman army. This had been evident, especially also in the previous couple of centuries, in terms of quality always. But of course it also adapts to the same technical, operational conditions. There is an influence from properly the combat styles that are functional, of course, to the context, but that also come with a certain change in the same training, in the same equipment. The barbarians themselves had been heavily Romanized in the process, so it's really a mutual exchange. It's an osmosis, right? We will see it better in some bit about arms and armor, but we have already documented it many times. So this phenomenon, its final degeneration, when in certain circumstances, and I'm sorry not to digress, but the video is not dedicated to that, that were characterized by a constant loss of contractual power, in fact, from the imperial authority over these groups that at some point had been even cooperative again, and even loyal, generally speaking. Just think about the Hunnic invasions. Of course, everybody had the interest in defending Gaul there, right? And the feather, as a consequence, evolved into the creation of true and proper autonomous areas within the imperial territory. I mean, to the point that it could not properly be controlled. There was properly a sphere dimension that could have not been reached. Mostly the Italian court pointed at the most obviously advantageous territories to reconquer. I mean, mostly southern Gaul, right? Not crossing the Massif Central, entering the the most important thing is coastal Spain, coastal Africa. That's what you need to still essentially control even great part of the hinterland, right? It's also what Justinian would rightly think later. And that's also a very underrated aspect of this all. So because nobody really cared too much about those more peripheral territories that had been importantly depopulated, even if when they had been resettled with the Foederati, right, that had just undergone an important deurbanization, the structuration of infrastructure, but this had been going on in some frontiers from centuries, right? So this was a world falling apart already, but by itself for everybody involved, right? So it was just about other groups being desperate enough from beyond the frontiers, wanting to push to enter and gain their own place in the sun. And so you have this great islands of provincial scale that basically are going to remain independent at some point by the Roman authority, being governed under any aspect by the foreign leaders that are settled there and that are dealing with the Romanized elites, and they are again making their ties in the way that is most suitable to them. This entails a great process of acculturation, of further Christianization, Catholicization of the barbarians. The Romano-Germanic kingdoms are effectively founded at this point, and in fact we talked about the barbarian kingdoms that were to rise in this agonizing Western Roman Empire, and in circumstances such as the loss, the relative tax income that became the appanage of the foreign leaders, there wasn't much you could do to even think by scale like before in a universal sense, at least in terms of practical territorial control. And as a consequence, the same Roman army would shrink ever further. right? There was properly an ethnic social change to some extent, even though the Germans were, as we've seen, not really particularly quantitative compared to the rest of the population. The latter was also spent. They were mostly colonists, peasants, right? And the proportion in the army was much higher because this Germanic populations, as we've seen, were just more militarized by themselves, so they were tougher, more driven, and so they sort of had maintained, even just psychologically, that greater proximity to traumatic violence, slaughtering large numbers of people, and that's why they served well as the army, right? And of course, the Germanic peoples themselves had, especially in the process of settlement, definitely changed their society. The wide majority of them is now becoming closer, in fact, to the Roman colonists. They are losing liberty. They have not really had much of that from quite a while back in the places of origin, and the migration era had accelerated the process of hierarchization of the elites, right? So these Romano-Germanic kingdoms are mostly run, and unavoidably so, by a nobiliar oligarchy of some sort. And in fact, you can see it in the armies themselves. I mean, the early Germanic armies had very strong infantry. Cavalry was meh. They were good at some individual level, but they didn't have even just the capacity of levying substantial amounts of them. Now it's a different story. Like in the 5th century, infantry is still decisive, but from the 6th, you start seeing cavalry becoming more important than infantry, right? And this corresponds to essentially the proto-feudalization of the same Romano-Germanic kingdoms and the general shrinking of, like, the exhaustion of the general population and the control by essentially a lordly individual. And so the same. The German leaders want to live like the Roman senators, right? And the majority of the German population is getting to be assimilated to the Roman colonists. We want actually to be like the Germans, because in general these have more status, at least in as much as they can bear arms, so they can also distinguish themselves more. Of course, there was, as we will see now, not just continuous mobilization, of course, of local military resources of some kind, mostly to a garrison dimension. Again, there are not major campaigns that are carried out, so in part because the mobile armies were not available, but you do see the permanence of some Roman professionals as distinctive units within the same Romano-Germanic kingdoms, notoriously. So the entire Pars Occidentis undergoes this phenomenon, right? The first lands to go were Britannia, Africa, and after the death of Majoranus in 461, also the Gallic territory undergoes a phase of gradual and definitive fragmentation. There is a decline, in fact, within the same communities that had taken over those lands. There are different barbarian groups that quarrel against one another, different clans, different lineages that are trying to elevate themselves to a royal status. And it's messy, right? And with the death of Majoranus, the failure of the Spanish campaign, and also the failure of the Eastern Roman fleet to crush Vandalic Carthage with the debacle of Cape Bon, it's basically clear that the Italian demographic and agricultural resources are not enough anymore to do what otherwise under Majoranus was still capable of doing. So essentially fielding a mobile army capable of recovering entire provinces. And so that's basically the moment in which the thing exhausts itself. This still doesn't mean that the West had to end 15 years later. That was mostly like a conscious political decision, right, to put an end formally to the thing. Otherwise, like, Odoacer would rule over Italy. This was one of the chunks, right? Together with the Visigothic one, the Frankish, then the Ostrogoths arrived to, in fact, refill Italy, even with other manpower. And again, things go on historically. And it's still late antiquity functioning, right? Most of these countries haven't been destructured, right? What you see mostly is in Britain, like some sort of revolution that is basically hidden because historically it's not possible to document, but we know, at least, there was something pretty bad going on, like literal fields, say boundaries redrawn, that there was literally the collapse of the system, of which just the Saxons took advantage, but mostly as mercenaries themselves entering. We'll talk about the Arthurian era, but at this point, before the Gothic War, Italy is functional. Spain is functional. Essentially, southern Gaul is functional. Even northern Gaul it's not faring too bad after all. Africa is functional under these other groups. So things would mostly, again, go downhill significantly in a structural sense from the mid-6th century rather than the mid-5th. In any case, however, by that point, this imperial Western thing is collapsing politically, institutionally. This is what formally brings an end to the mobile regional armies that cease to function, vanishing de facto as organized entities, because even just their military the strategic concentration doesn't have sense. It's better at this point to garrison mostly the entire picture. There aren't other invasions around either. Consider this, as we were saying before. Again, in fact, the most functional and active of these chunks would be Italy, because at least throughout the 5th century, mostly the Franks take over northern Gaul and start expanding. I made multiple videos about Clovis explaining why they were so successfully aggressive compared to the other peoples, like they kick ass, against the Alemanni, the Burgundians, the Visigoths, and we'll talk about that. It's against Merovingian expansionism. In fact, also the Justinian reconquest of the West was actually addressed. But it's there that you have still the center, like the idea that Italy is the center of the West, and that you send their other active peoples to sort of take the reins of Rome, right? There is no such thing like our own empire without a control on Rome, directly or indirectly. And this brings also the former provinces of the Western Roman Empire internally fragmented, because if you do not have a single army at a regional level, it means that the local power is not unitary either. So you have these various barbarian chiefs that fight against one another, and that only at some point, especially in Gaul, this is evident. That's why also the Franks are so successful. Gregory of Tours makes it very clear that Clovis had brought an order after all, after so much distress, even though Gaul had not been particularly destroyed, right? Romanity lived consistently overall in this land, and it was at the root of much of the fortune of the Merovingian power as the largest in Europe. Also the Presentalis army, that is to say the mix of both, this was the army of the Magister Utriusque Militia, right? The cavalry or the infantry was at this point an army constituted almost exclusively by foreign contingents, given that also the very powerful Magistra Militum of the last years of the Western Roman Empire had used this force mostly just to defend Italy, right? And this was, again, the only region remained formally until 476 under imperial authority, at least in an administrative sense. But at the same time, these guys they had been, of course, also of barbarian ancestry in part themselves. They had kept these forces mostly to maintain their own power. So the fact that Odoacer's army, as we were saying before, was constituted mostly by war bands of different peoples was the mirroring of this, that after all, the Roman army in Italy had still been able to glue together other groups rather than giving way to a single people, right? Which had not happened in so far. It wouldn't happen until Theodoric's Ostrogoths were sent by Constantinople. And you know the story that these magistri militum had, as generalissimi, elevated or eliminated this sort of puppet emperors that were necessary for them, in as much as they and especially I would say because they were originally barbarians themselves, they could have never become emperors, right? Plus, of course, the obvious reason that the imperial authority was the only one that could legitimize any military command in the first place. And meaningfully enough, these guys do not crown themselves emperors, right? It would have been inconceivable. They knew they could not work because this was still a Roman world, and it would have not been recognized in the first place. And I think this also from other peoples around, I mean, in the West, is a great sign also of respect towards imperial authority that was definitely always there. While we will see this last topic in another video, it's important to cite a couple of authors about the aforementioned Roman troops that remained during these events, like cut off from the imperial authority, where they found themselves isolated, at some point completely devoid of any reference to the central level. And so that ended up often to be used by the various barbarian reigns as allies. This also is fascinating because, as we just said, these barbarian kingdoms were not elevating themselves to an imperial authority. I mean, individually they thought, of course, that part of the imperium now was parceled to the various kingdoms that had been formed, right, from the ecumenic unity of the empire, like just by God. But they realized that these imperial soldiers of Rome were something different from them. And they couldn't quite claim an authority on them as such. Right? It was a prestige, was too high. Something that legitimized their own settlement and rule itself, especially when it came to the international arena. Right? And so those Roman soldiers basically act as allies, as Foederati, if you want, of the same Romano-Germanic rulers. So a very meaningful inversion of roles, right? So the first author is, this is also the most famous quote, Procopius, right? That in his Gothic War 112, we are in the 6th century obviously, is very clear in describing, quote, the Roman soldiers that had been put to the defense of the furthermost goal, that not having had a way to come back to Rome, nor wanting to pass over to their enemies that were Arians, they gave up themselves together with their insignia and the territory that they defended to the Arborici and to the Germans, right? Transmitting every tradition to their offspring, they preserved their fatherly customs that are, still to this day, Procopius says in the 6th century, respected, because still they are distinguished depending on the legions in which they served in ancient times, and they go to battle preceded by their own insignia, observing constantly their fatherly laws, and maintain the Roman ways, the Roman fashion also in the footwear and in any other part. Now this passage is very, very fascinating, because let's skip the part on the religious allegiance, because of course here there was a matter of Catholic opposition to Arian belief that was oddly similar to the Protestant one, and that in any case was crushed at this point historically. And in fact the single most here we're talking Gaul, and the single greatest success was for the Merovingians to immediately convert the Franks from paganism to Catholicism without passing through Arianism. Right, this was incredibly important. But again, I discussed this in videos about the Merovingians. Here, the remarkable thing is that after generations, after the fall of the West, because of course Procopius writes after the Gothic wars, so we are in the second half of the 6th century, essentially you can say 1 century after the fall of the West, in Gaul, by the way, and in here it's in furthermost Gaul, right? So the northern part, the one that had been more de-Romanized and urbanized and sort of remained more distant, and in part that's why he talks about these guys, because they were the ones who had properly been cut out. That these guys remembered, of course, the fact that they were Roman soldiers, right? They remembered their fatherly customs, that they respected, as they remembered essentially in which legions they used to fight, right? And they went to battle with their own insignia, so maintaining essentially the existence of these units, right? Some of which here the Roman legions had in some ways remained. We've seen it in some videos about also the Eastern Roman army of the 6th century. Some in the administration, some bore the name of the very early legions of the Principate, even Caesar times, right? Naturally, many others were newer, but still there was that sense that it was such an enormous institution at this point, more than 600 years old. Just think about the force of tradition and what this meant for these people, right? And they were allowed to do so. You see, these were evidently respected troops because they were of the first quality, and so the local Germanic rulers were quite aware of the value of these forces. They bear their own insignia that are obviously maintained to them as like the honor of arms, basically, because they are evidently military communities that follow the Roman laws, and that still sort of follow this fashion. The other quote is the Vita Severini by Eugippius, Vita Severini 20, if you want to search the reference, that discusses essentially the survival of certain groups of Roman soldiers in the Norian Alps, somewhere like today's Austria, basically, still by the end of the 5th century. That is actually, well, yes, so obviously later, after the fall of the West, but still in a context that can be connected with the persistence of some idea that even if Odoacer had had brought back the ensigns, to Constantinople, some areas, think about Nepos to some extent, had still gone on, had not recognized that, and they thought they were still under Roman administration because there was a Roman Empire. Again, as we said at the beginning, the fact that the western half of the Roman Empire falls administratively has nothing to do with the fall of the Roman Empire. also considering that Constantinople has a hell of a power, and especially in these years, it's really evident how much it has managed to survive. I made some videos speaking of exactly those years. I mean, again, problems for everyone at this point, so it's not that Constantinople could simply come back at that point, but in some 30, 40 years they would be able to, at least not there. But if you think about it, also Alaric, Theodoric's Ostrogoths are actually controlling part of those lands. Ostrogothic Italy controlled Provence, basically everything up to the Danube in the north parts of Illyricum. That the area was contested in part, like there was at least some administrative ambiguity, some areas that technically had belonged to the west, but that now the Byzantines had gradually occupied, right? But this is relevant because even under the Goths, of course, the sense is that that broader dominion was under Rome. And so technically there wouldn't be anything strange about the persistence of Roman troops even in areas they thought to be still connected literally to the empire, if they were in Noricum, for example. So not just, some Roman soldier that fought under the Merovingians, like in Procopius times, right? So that's quite interesting as well, and it also entails, by the way, that the way, and this is true for, in fact, Procopius mentioned as well, that the way these troops would be able to maintain these military traditions was, of course, the largely unaltered, unchanged military administration in the Romano-Germanic kingdoms. I mean, surely these troops still partly received what had historically been the support of the Annona in different ways. I mean, there is unfortunately not much to document how this happened, but primarily we're talking about natural goods that were exacted evidently because these units were some sort of clan now, as it's evident, especially considering themselves as ethnic Romans in evidently some territories that were controlled by other peoples who were gradually now blending the Romans and the Germans. And that I made a video about how essentially these peoples would become German juridically, right? So in part also these soldiers at a point, we do not know precisely when they sort of died out, but it's this most obvious realization that they still acted, in spite of the general cooling of the situation, as garrison forces. They controlled a district. They had some mention in this broader governmental responsibility. So their military force was quite regarded also for this reason. And this is not to discuss what we have seen again in that video about the Merovingian army organization, how much, for example, the Roman military had remained, at least for example, in the militias of the cities that were surely the centers of Romanity more than other places that were sort of, more easily co-opted by the Germanic lifestyle. There is some further consideration again, but we'll have to make some more specific video about these relics of the Roman army in the West, and some of this can be seen also in the way the Foederati had been serving Rome, right? Were these still considered Foederati to some point? Not much in a truly subtle sense. I mean, by Justinian's reconquest, you had the Summacoi Foederati, that are, however, some sort of broader allies, like some foreign power that is so friend to you. And they send troops they sent. This was typical, I don't know, some princes to be fostered in Constantinople or this kind of stuff, but technically there is not that administrative continuity in the title for which, even if the empire was able to reconquer vast parts of the Mediterranean, this would have to necessarily make these peoples reverting to some sort of subjection to Rome. Like, it was not really possible. At least the Vandals, the Goths, fought to the death, basically. The Merovingians could not be tamed in that regard. There was a lot of, again, of sense that this whole space was Roman, and that especially, like, it was evident how the Byzantine Empire was still capable of pursuing especially the Justinian era, an ecumenic policy of some sort, but it was also a different system. It was also much more highlighting the divide between the coastal and the continental dimension. It was just being accompanied by other attacks, other invasions. The Byzantines had still to cope with the Persians. The Longobards invaded Italy. There are other peoples from the steppes that are really knocking at the door. There are the Slavs that are basically overrunning endemically many areas. And aside from this, like, these are all things that pass most, in fact, from the west to the east to understand. And so either we proceed with the Romano-Germanic kingdoms' histories that I do in detail, but fragmented because that's what they were, or you pass to the Byzantine Empire, and that's another story. Alright, so I think it's quite interesting to see even how relatively rapid this passage really was, but also how much continuity actually persisted in the West, so that when we look at Latin Germanic Europe, we're mostly looking at a system that keeps owing enormously, especially in the south, to Romanity, and there is no such thing at this point like a true boundary for that. The world is still Roman, and that's what essentially everybody will be attracted to later on still. And so the Roman Empire never died, at least until Napoleon, and that's in fact not even the usual 1453. And you know that on this channel I dig pretty viscerally into these topics. We haven't done that too often recently, and I think a long time that I don't make Renovatio Imperii video, but we will surely at some point come back on it. This is what I wanted to talk about mostly. Then we will talk about something more pertinent to the Western Roman Empire some other point. We'll talk about more the Roman army of this period, which we haven't quite covered more than much, nor in the East nor in the West. Let's consider this a beginning. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.